Thanks, Paul. Right, let's see if I can get the screen sharing to work. And hopefully you can now see a slide that says BGA FRTOL course part 3. Can you just give me a quick wave? Thanks very much indeed. Yeah, good. Okay, so the format today is I'm going to go through a few specific topics from the part 3 lecture, which you should have studied before you came onto the call today. If your private study raised any questions, or there are any questions that come up as a result of what I'm going to say today, as Paul has just mentioned, do please send them along to Paul or Chula, who hopefully will be answering them, or if not, maybe they'll bounce them over to me if I'm really unlucky. Let's change, right. Okay, today's agenda. So we're going to briefly recap some of the part 3 topics. I'm not really going to say very much more than what's been in the material you've already studied. We're going to do that for hopefully 30 minutes maximum. Topics we're just going to touch on are transponders, a little bit about basic service and the other kinds of service that you might expect to get, MATS penetration, and Class D zone clearance. The last topic in the part 3 lecture that you've already looked at was ATZs and landing clearances. I propose to put those off till next week when Paul will cover them as part of his motor glider flight lecture. Then we'll have time for questions, 5 minutes minimum, see if we can make it a little bit longer. As I've mentioned, please do send them over to Chula or Paul via Zoom chat. Then we're going to do the breakouts, and we'll have almost an hour of breakouts today because we've got some quite complicated scripts for you to run through. The first one will be a MATS penetration example taken from the example flight you've already studied. That will be at Lakenheath. At 11 o'clock, as you know, the Royal College of Nursing and others have arranged or have suggested a 1-minute silence to remember NHS staff who have died in the course of the current COVID outbreak. We should be able to fit that in between the 2 breakouts. And then we'll go into the second breakout, getting a Class D zone clearance out of Bryce Norton, again, as per the slides you've already studied. And then we'll have a few minutes to wrap up. So a few words about transponders. I can see about 25 people on the screen. If you fly a glider cross-country routinely with a transponder, can you give me a wave, please? I've got maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. So, I mean, it would be interesting to know, to have hard data, but it's probably only 10%, maybe 15% of glider pilots routinely fly cross-country with a transponder. And that makes us rather the exception in the flying world. Most other aircraft flying around out there, except for some home builds and so on, have transponders. A GRP or a wooden glider without a transponder gives a very weak primary radar return on the screen of a radar controller. Weak to sometimes non-existent. It depends on the particular radar. And even if you do have give a return on a radar, sometimes when you stop to thermal, the filter on the radar that prevents things like wind turbines and traffic on the roads appearing on the radar filters you out as well. So when you stop to thermal, you disappear off the screen. And even if you do give a return on the radar, ground radar cannot detect your altitude just from a primary return. A transponder is an electronic gadget, as you probably know, that is fitted to your aircraft, which, when you're painted by the radar, by the ground radar, transmits a strong secondary signal. So this means that, first of all, you show up as a nice firm blip on the radar screen. And the transponder also transmits back at least 2 further bits of information. Modern transponders can send back a lot more information, but even the old ones transmit back at least 2 bits of information in that secondary return. One is your altitude, although it'll only do that if the transponder is set to, on this example that you can see, alt. And the strong guidance from everybody is all the time you have your transponder switched on in the air, leave it set to alt so that the radar controller can see your altitude. The second thing that it'll transmit back is a so-called squawk code, which is manually set by you into the transponder, usually in response to a request from the controller. Little bit of trivia. Why is it called a squawk code? Modern transponders are the descendants of equipment that was designed in the Second World War for identification, friend or foe. I am told that the IFF set had the code name Parrot, and therefore when you were being asked by a military controller to dial up the IFF code into your Parrot, it came to be called the squawk for your Parrot, and the name has stuck. So you're going to dial in a squawk code, a 4-digit squawk code, in response to a request for a control from a controller, or there are some other circumstances which we won't go into where you might dial up a particular code. But if you're not talking to a controller and you haven't dialed up a code for a different reason, you should leave your transponder set to either 7000, or as a new development within the last couple of months, the CAA now wants us, if we're flying IFR, to dial up 2000 as the squawk code. If you're thermaling on a nice day, climbing to a 4,000 feet cloud base in Class G airspace, for the last 1,000 foot of that climb, you are technically flying in instrument meteorological conditions, so you should probably be squawking 2000 rather than the 7,000 you would have been squawking last season. One last detail, there is an ident button on the front of the transponder. If the controller asks you, press that ident button and that will highlight your blip on his screen or her screen. Only do that if asked. So a slide that you'll recognize from Paul's online presentation. This is how squawking aircraft appear on a radar display. You can see each of these traces has a 4-digit code, 7000, or some other code that that particular aircraft is squawking, and in some cases also has a flight level, 5329, whatever. There is some specific phraseology around use of secondary surveillance radar. The most important bit is what we've already covered. If asked by a controller to squawk, for example, glider Charlie Delta, squawk 6201, your response is to dial 6201 in and then respond, once you've dialed it in, squawk 6201, glider Charlie Delta. Squawk code is a mandatory readback. Now, for the 80% of you who don't have a transponder, and that includes me, I don't fly with a transponder, your response is negative transponder. I've sometimes seen people use negative squawk, but technically the precise CAP 413 terminology is negative transponder. There are some other bits of SSR phraseology on this slide. We're not going to cover them specifically today. Useful to study, but they're also fairly obvious. That was a quick recap of the material on transponders we're going to use today. Now let's talk a little bit about basic service. What is a basic service? It's a framework that allows an air traffic service unit to give pilots information that's useful for the safe and efficient conduct of flights. Normally that includes things like conditions at the airfield where the ATSU is based, which runway is in use, weather, winds, and so on. It may include unsolicited traffic information passed from the ATSU to you, the glider pilot. But really don't bet on it. Apart from anything else, if the controller is not aware of the other traffic, if it isn't transponding or they don't have radar, then obviously they can't tell you about it. So even when you're in receipt of a basic service, you should not in any way reduce your lookout. Separation from aircraft, other aircraft, using see and avoid remains your responsibility. Now for us as glider pilots, perhaps more importantly, basic service also provides us with a framework to tell the controllers at busy nearby airfields where we are and where we're going. Again, if we're not transponding or they don't have radar, there's no other way that they're going to know. So perhaps slightly ironically, although in theory the basic service is being provided from the controller to us, in practice in gliding, we are helping the controllers by calling up to get a basic service. My experience is that although you may use other bits of RT infrequently, almost every flight that I make out of Granston Lodge, if I'm going past either Cambridge or Cranfield, I'm going to be calling them for a basic service to let them know that I'm here, and that helps everybody's safety. Basic service can be provided to flights in either VFR or IFR in Class G airspace. It can also be provided to VFR flights in Class E controlled airspace, and we are starting to see a little bit more Class E airspace around the country at the moment. But if you're flying IFR in Class E controlled airspace, you will be, it is controlled airspace, you will be under control and you will not receive a basic service when you're IFR in Class E. And as we've already covered, basic service can be provided by air traffic control officers or FISOs, but not air-to-ground operators. So you can get a basic service out of Cambridge Radar or Lakenheath Approach, or indeed Sywell Information, but you won't get a basic service out of Enstone Radio, for instance. So what are your obligations if you're in receipt of a basic service? Important to say, you remain free to maneuver as you wish, unless you have agreed a specific limitation with the controller, i.e. for instance, not to go above a particular level, which they may have asked you to honour in order to help them coordinate with other aircraft. But unless you've specifically agreed to a limitation, you can carry on your flight just as you would have done if you hadn't been receiving the service. Your most important obligation, in my view, is to respond to requests to report position. Those are the words the controller will use. And you should reply with your call sign, your position. If that's not a current position, if it was a couple of minutes ago, then give the time of the position as minutes past the hour. Very importantly, give your level. The most common mistake I hear on the channel in response to report position is people will give their position laterally, but miss out the altitude information, and the controller really wants to know that. And then you can optionally give your next waypoint and ETA, although if you can give your ETA at your next waypoint in a glider, you're a better glider pilot than I am. Now, if all of this comes at an inconvenient moment, when you're scraping away in a low save and a weak thermal, then by all means tell the controller to stand by. Don't keep them waiting too long, but you can certainly tell them to stand by. A trick I've evolved over the years, I now carry a small portable GPS, an old Garmin in fact, in the side pocket of the glider. Before I call up for a basic service, I dial in the airfield from which I'm about to get the service. The Garmin then gives me a range and bearing to that airfield, so that if I'm asked to report position, even if I'm busy, it's fairly easy to fish the Garmin out of the side pocket and give a QDM, that's to say the bearing to that airfield, and range, which can be in nautical miles. I set up the Garmin for nautical miles, that's what controllers understand, and obviously give them level off the altimeter. If you don't do that, you can also do it with reference to map features, towns, airfields, and so on. Some flight computers also allow you to set up a separate screen to get the same information, a distance and bearing from an airfield. Very importantly, a very important obligation if you're in receipt of a basic service, when you sign off, when you leave the channel, before you leave the channel, you must sign off. And avoiding other traffic absolutely remains your responsibility using See and Avoid. Now, it is possible, although it's rare, that you will ask for a basic service and the controller will say no. They might be very busy. Some radar controllers, particularly at Lakenheath, in my experience, get a bit confused when somebody without a transponder asks for a service. I've certainly been denied service at Lakenheath, I suspect simply because there's no transponder return, and the novice controller couldn't really cope with this. It is rare. If it happens, don't fret. It's their loss. Acknowledge with Roger. You should probably, just to be absolutely clear that you're not going to talk to them again, tell them that you are changing en route. I did get a question, incidentally, earlier on the chat channels before we got started.
Andrew, can I just interrupt very briefly?
Sure.
Any coaches who haven't indicated their names with a star, could they do that now, please? Because I'm about to create the breakout groups. Sorry for that. Keep going.
No, thanks, Paul. I did get a question on the chat channel. What is changing en route? What does that actually mean? Although it's not in CAP 413, in discussion with the CAA, it seems that an appropriate phrase for us to use to mean I'm changing channel now, and I don't particularly want to have to specify exactly which channel I'm changing to. An appropriate phrase for that is changing en route. It basically just means I'm leaving the frequency. You don't actually have to leave the frequency, of course. You can stay listening to them if you want to, but it just indicates to them that they shouldn't expect to talk to you again. Now, as an aside, I have an annual coordination meeting with the Lakenheath controllers, just to let them know a bit about gliding and what we do. If you are denied a service specifically at Lakenheath, as a favour, I'd appreciate it if you could let me know so that I can judge to what extent this is happening. So it's happened to me a couple of times. And we need to let the controllers know that basically if they deny us a service, it's their loss, not ours. There are other types of flight information service. If you're doing the FRTOL test or you fly power, this may well be relevant to you. I suspect, particularly if you don't fly with a transponder, these other service types are not really of interest. They're covered in the course slides and also in CAP 1434. If you do ask for a different kind of service, for instance, you ask for a traffic service and you don't have a transponder, you'll probably be offered a basic service instead. And for this and other reasons, service type is a mandatory readback. You must read back the type of service that you believe you have from the controller to make sure that you and the controller agree. Let's talk a little bit about MATSs. A MATS is a military aerodrome traffic zone. It's pronounced MATS on the channel. It's an area surrounding many military airfields. It has the same class as the surrounding airspace. So, for instance, in the case of Lakenheath, it's all Class G airspace. And perhaps slightly paradoxically, civilian aircraft need no clearance to enter. You'd be completely legal to fly into a MATS without talking to the controller or even in a glider with no radio at all. But it's good airmanship and good manners, as well as enhances everybody's safety, to request MATS penetration before you fly into the MATS. Now, this is a request that cannot be denied, so the phraseology is perhaps a bit quirky, but the controller will respond with MATS penetration approved. This is not a clearance, so there's no need to read it back. The MATS contains an ATZ, and that does require a separate entry clearance. Because you've been approved into the MATS, that does not mean that you can automatically enter the ATZ. If you want to enter the ATZ, you must get a separate clearance. In my experience, many MATS controllers will say MATS penetration approved, remain clear of the ATZ, just to underline this point. Many military airfields, the ATSU talks to their aircraft, the military aircraft, on UHF radio, which you cannot receive. So you are unlikely to hear their RT. Even at military airfields where they do talk to their aircraft on VHF, they probably put them on a different channel to the civilians who are getting MATS penetration clearances. So MATS penetration approvals. So you can't necessarily judge how busy the airfield is just by listening to the channel. At the same time as you request MATS penetration, you should also request basic service and have all the obligations that go along with that. So if we were entering the Lakenheath MATS, first thing we'd have to do is find the channel. It may well be programmed into your radio memory. Do make sure your radio is kept up to date. If it's not in your radio memory, then the CAA frequency card is a useful resource. Print it out, tuck it into your side pocket. They update it a couple of times a year, so make sure you have a current one. That clip in the top right of the slide is from the late 2019 frequency card. Incidentally, the CAA recently got a bit confused about the Lakenheath radar approach channel, They changed it on the most recent card, but I'm told they're going to change it back to 128.9 on the next card. It's also marked on the chart. You can see there a clip from the 500,000 chart with the CMATs indicated. The C in CMAT simply stands for combined, because it's the combined Lakenheath and Mildenhall mats.
Andrew, can I just make a comment there?
Sure.
I've been getting, you might know, I publish a series of radio frequencies. I've been getting one of my club members who's been going through it and checking it against things like the FRC for me, which is very, very convenient. It keeps coming up with queries. There's a lot of errors on the FRC, and it's somewhat out of date, even the current published one. So you really, if you're going to use that, you really need to check no terms as well.
Okay, and the ultimate and definitive resource is the AIP. And no one's going to be suggesting that you're checking this in flight, but if you are planning a flight and there is some doubt about the channel to use, you can go to either the civilian AIP, which is at this URL, or if you Google for military AIP, you can download the entire AIP for military airfields and find out all the many and complicated channels that different airfields use. But the AIP is definitive. You will always get the answer there if there's any doubt. So retune, listen, maybe get the QNH from other traffic that's on the channel, and then request basic service and MATS penetration. And that's basically all you need to do over and above receiving a basic service. After that, your RT will be the same as for any basic service. Final topic, let's just talk briefly about Class D controlled airspace. There is Class D in varying shapes surrounding some regional airports, such as Norwich, Bristol, Doncaster and Aberdeen, and also around RAF Brize Norton. Different shapes marked on your chart, and typically going from, in the case of Brize Norton anyway, going from the ground to 3,500 feet. A clearance is required to cross a Class D zone to enter that airspace. Again, to get your clearance, as before for the MATs, get the channel, enter it into your radio, call them up, ideally 10 minutes or so before you get to the edge of the zone, and request zone penetration. Now, you will only be allowed into the zone if you've got a clearance. You must hear the word cleared in the response. If you don't hear the word cleared, you are not allowed to enter the zone. Clearance is important. It can have various conditions attached to it. When you get the clearance, you must read it back in full with all the conditions, if there were any. The controller should read it back to you slowly enough that you can write it down. Whether you actually choose to write it down is your decision. Perhaps scribble it on the corner of your map. Make sure you've got it straight in your mind or on paper. If necessary, ask the controller to say again. Either say again, which means the whole message again, please, or say again all after a particular word if you only want the latter part of the clearance read back to you. Get the clearance straight in your mind and then read it back to them as per the example in both the part 3 online lecture and indeed in the example which I hope you studied before this session. A little bit more on clearances. Your clearance will be either IFR, VFR or special VFR. You're only going to get an IFR clearance if you have a Mode S transponder. That's mandatory to have a Mode S transponder to fly IFR inside Class D controlled airspace. If you don't have a transponder, your choices are either VFR or special VFR. On a good gliding day, there are visibility requirements, but on any good gliding day, they will be met. The thing to remember about VFR in Class D is that you must remain more than 1,000 feet vertically and 1,500 meters horizontally from cloud whilst you're inside the airspace. If you get a special VFR clearance, then the restrictions go down to being in sight of the surface and clear of cloud. Now, on entry, you're liable to be put under radar control. But an important point to note, although that sounds very reassuring, important point to note is that the controller only guarantees to separate IFR traffic from other IFR traffic or from SVFR traffic. If you're cleared VFR, separation from all other aircraft inside the zone nevertheless remains your responsibility using see and avoid. You will hopefully get help from the controller via traffic information or even instructions to change course in order to avoid other traffic. But again, ultimately, separation, even though you're under radar control, separation remains your responsibility. Now, a new item in CAP 413 coming into force about now, if you use the call sign glider, then implicit in that is that when you're crossing the airspace, you may deviate up to 2 nautical miles from a straight line track or stop to thermal, and the controller will also understand that your altitude may vary. If he's giving a clearance or she's giving a clearance to power traffic, they're going to assume that you're flying in a straight line at a constant altitude. Use the call sign glider, they will no longer make that assumption. That's a big plus. You may still get other restrictions, altitude restrictions or requests, or lateral limitations. Some examples are given on this slide. If you are unable to comply with these restrictions, then use the words unable to comply or just unable to tell the controller, and tell them obviously as soon as possible and always before you break the restriction. So that's it. We've got a minute or two for questions. I can see 1 or 2 coming in. Paul and Chula, if you'd like to marshal the questions, let's take those.
Okay, we've had a series of questions which we've largely dealt with on the chat, but I'll just run through them. So why are we talking to Lakenheath rather than Mildenhall? It's because Lakenheath control the combined max. There's one frequency for both places, and that frequency is on the chart. What else have we got? Andrew said regional airports are Class D, so a Heathrow, Gatwick and Stansted, points out George Knight, and he's absolutely right. You're fairly unlikely to get a clearance through those, so you've got to use your common sense here. Brize Zone might not be too busy, so you can go through that. Norwich, Donington, places like that, but you're not going to get into Heathrow. Do you have to ask the special VFR, or do they decide? No, you have to ask for it. You tell them what you want. And oh yes, is it request? Is it a MATS penetration or a MATS crossing? CAT 413 generally uses the word MATS penetration. Okay, that's me. Okay, Chula?
No, they've all just been covered.
Great.
The RT ones have been covered anyway.
Good. If you have any other questions, do continue to ask them on the chat or send them afterwards by email, and we'll handle them one way or another. So what we're going to do now very shortly is we're going to go to breakout. Hopefully you have available either in printout or on screen the session, the notes. There's a segment of the 500,000 chart that shows your route. You're coming in over Cambridge, heading towards Bury. You're then going to turn Bury North and head back to the west. Somewhere, probably around Newmarket, you're going to give Lakenheath a call and ask them for a basic service and MATS penetration. And at some point, hopefully your coach, being the controller, having given you that service and MATS penetration, will ask you for a position report, give them a position report, and then at some point after that, you're going to leave the zone, and when you're clear of the MATS, you're going to call clear of the MATS, changing en route. And your coach, once you've got that absolutely word perfect, will then throw a few variations in just to keep it interesting. So Paul, I think we can go to breakouts.
Okay.
I'll just share screen and we'll just do the wrap-up slide. So hopefully you can see that. So just to wrap up, hope this week was useful. Just to say once again, if there are any questions, you can try putting them on the chat channel now. We may have time for final questions, or if not, by email, please. For next week, inevitably, we're going to be doing part 4, the TMG flight. I think Paul is doing this one. and in particular, in addition to having some terminology around powered flying, we'll also be doing ATZ entry and landing in that session. So once again, please study the materials before the session, and there should also be some scripts for the breakouts available before the session.
Yeah, if I can just say something about that one, Andrew.
Yep, thank you.
This is the bit of the course where we cover the powered stuff. So we've tried to orient the course around being a glider pilot, but because this is a full FRTOL, this is where you learn the other stuff. But it's not necessarily such a big stretch, because you can add a TNG rating to your gliding license pretty straightforwardly, and you'll need all this stuff if you do that. So that's that. Back to you, Andrew.
Yeah, nothing more to say. Are there any questions, Paul or Chula?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is Paul will add the questions to the FAQ because it's difficult to keep track of them all. But there's one here which says, when should we add VFR into the conversation for entry into the controlled airspace, initial or full message? I think it's my answer to that is request VFR transit of zone is what I would say. So I think it goes in at the beginning. In a glider, it's pretty much assumed.
Yeah, I think I would have typically put it in the second bit. Luke, what would you expect?
Sorry, say again, Paul.
If I want a VFR transit, do you want the VFR bit in the initial message or the full message?
I'd make the assumption you VFR, especially if you're on a basic service.
Okay.
It'd be down to you to tell me if otherwise. So I just assume VFR.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions, Chula?
I'm just reading now. If I'm reading as I'm allowed, if we were overflying Bryce zone but not below 3.5, what type of conversation would be appropriate? Well, I'm going to say basic service. If you're above it and you're not asking for a transit, then it's a basic service.
Yeah, we had this on the mats as well. Should we call somebody if we're above a mat?
Yeah.
Bryce zone is quite big, so if you're overflying it, you're probably thinking about what happens if you can't stay high. Yeah. So I'd want to talk to them about at least a possible zone penetration to get that teed up in case I needed it.
Sure. I'm just being a bit literal at this time of the day.
That's fine. But I mean, it's a valid point. Yeah. I'll do that with Max's as well. Even if I think I can stay above, I'll get an approval to go into it if I have to.
Yeah,
I mean, there's nothing to lose with the mats. You know, if you get mats approval and don't use it, what's the problem?
Yeah.
I'm going to read another one here. It might have to go into the FAQ from Sandy. It says, if flying in cloud with a cloud rating, can you cross a zone? And second question, are you VFR or IFR? I'm not going to rush an answer to that.
Well, the second question is you're clearly IFR. You can't be VFR in cloud. And you can't be VFR within 1,000 feet of cloud. Yeah. So you're absolutely, definitely IFR. No problem going through a MATS in cloud. And I've put a thing about that on the frequently asked questions. Who do you talk to? The cloud flying channel or the person whose MATS you're above? And I would talk to the person whose MATS I was above, because I don't want them sending airplanes through the bit of sky I'm in. A Class D zone, interesting question. I think you're pushing it a bit to go in cloud in a Class D zone, but the controllers might have a view.
Okay, I'll take that. I don't think unless you are suitably qualified, you can fly IFR in Class D airspace just like that. I'm pretty sure that's the case.
Mark, would you be agreeing that if someone's IFR in Class D, you'd be expecting to be able to maintain headings and levels and everything else? So it's, for a glider, it's one of those things that's really it's not compatible with gliding, really.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah.
Just from a legal point of view, I think it's okay actually, but I think from a practical point, and we can have that conversation offline, but from a practical point of view, I think you might struggle.
Bottom line, if the controller doesn't clear you, you can't do it. And of course, just to underline one point, you absolutely have to have a transponder to be IFR in Class D airspace.
Is that the case? Okay.
It is absolutely the case. AIP Gen 1.5.
Thank you. Okay, we are at 11:30, which is our Cinderella needs to go home time. So thank you very much.
One question, please. Sorry.
Yeah.
You also need an instrument rating if you're IFR in Class D.
No, you don't. No, you don't. Anyway, that's a different thing. Giles, you had a question.
Yeah, sorry, we didn't quite finish in the breakout room, just because it's a little bit more in depth. Do we have any opportunity at this point to jump back into breakout rooms for just those that want to, or not? Or is it just our group that we overran?
I can drop you back into breakout rooms, and everybody who doesn't want to go can leave. Yeah. You want me to do that?
Yes, please, just for us. If anybody else, then that's true.
Sorry.
Can I just ask a question on the script before you do that?
Yeah.
When you're leaving control on the back of the script, you've got glider Charlie Delta leaving controlled airspace basic service. Yeah. But then you've got sometime later, you've got the glider saying clear of your zone, request change en route. I'm not sure how they would know that. And then you've got the ATC cleared to change en route, squawk conspicuous, radar service terminates, but you've already terminated it.
Yeah. Okay. But if I was talking to Lake and Heath would still would tell me that, definitely.
But you've already had basic service terminated.
No, you went to basic service. You left radar control and went to basic service when you crossed the zone boundary.
Yeah, and then you've got radar service terminates after that, but you've already left radar service.
You've left radar control. It's a good question, Simon. I'm not entirely sure of the answer. I might have to pick it up with one of the air traffickers to see whether we've got that right.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Steve Nash, if I could go back to finish my group with the breakout, please.
Yeah, I'm going to drop everybody in. What we'll do is we won't do a coaches wrap up on this one, because there's a demand to go back into breakouts. I'm going to drop people back into breakouts. If you want to go to breakouts, go to breakouts. To finish with your group. If not, just sign off. So you can take the choice. Everybody happy with that?
Yep.
Okay. Let me see if I
Thanks,
can do
Paul.
that. Off you go. See you next week.
Cheerio.
Thanks very much.